Turkey is no longer the middle-tier regional player many in the West still imagine. It is moving rapidly, decisively, and with a clear strategic purpose, faster than most analysts are willing to admit. In an international system defined by ruthless competition and shifting power balances, Turkey is now positioning itself as a rising superpower with the capabilities, ambitions, and geopolitical leverage to reshape entire regions. This is happening not in decades, but in real time before our eyes. Most policymakers in Washington and Brussels are still trapped in an outdated framework that treats Turkey as a junior partner inside NATO. That illusion is evaporating. A state with a booming defense industry, expanding geopolitical depth from the Mediterranean to the Caucasus, and the willingness to challenge the United States, Russia, and Europe simultaneously cannot be dismissed as a mere ally with attitude problems. It is behaving like an emerging great power, one that intends to carve out its own sphere of influence. This transformation carries profound consequences. As Turkey rises, it will demand autonomy, respect, and strategic space. And if history teaches us anything, it is that rising powers do not wait patiently for the dominant players to grant them those things. They take them, which forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth of what comes next, because the implications for the balance of power are only beginning to unfold as we move into the core analysis of this lecture. Turkey's strategic awakening did not happen overnight, nor did it emerge from a vacuum. It is the product of structural forces that have been building for 2 decades, driven by shifts in global power, the failures of Western policy, and Turkey's own recognition that its security and influence can no longer be outsourced to other states. For much of the Cold War, Turkey was a subordinate player within the American-led order, serving primarily as NATO's southeastern flank against the Soviet Union. It was strategically important, but its role was largely reactive, defined by Washington's containment strategy rather than its own ambitions. That arrangement held as long as the United States remained the dominant power and the regional environment stayed relatively stable. Neither of those conditions exist today. The unipolar moment is fading, and states that once accepted secondary roles are now reconsidering their place in the hierarchy. Turkey is one of the clearest examples. As American power declines relative to its competitors, and as the Middle East and Eurasia become more contested, Ankara has realized that depending exclusively on the United States for security is no longer a viable long-term strategy. This realization accelerated after 2003, when the Iraq War destabilized Turkey's southern borders and empowered Kurdish groups that Ankara views as existential threats. From Turkey's perspective, the United States created a geopolitical disaster zone right next door and expected Turkey to simply adjust to it. That was not going to happen. By 2016, the rupture became even deeper. The attempted coup, which Turkish leaders believe was either ignored or quietly tolerated by elements in the West, convinced Ankara that the existing alliance system was unreliable. Whether that perception is entirely correct is irrelevant. What matters is how the Turkish state interpreted the event. From that moment, the political leadership became convinced that Turkey must chart its own independent strategic course. It was no longer enough to be a loyal NATO member. Turkey needed to be a power in its own right. We see the consequences of that shift in virtually every region surrounding Turkey. In Syria, Ankara abandoned any expectation that Washington would accommodate its security concerns. Instead, it launched successive military operations to carve out buffer zones and push back Kurdish militant groups. In the South Caucasus, Turkey decisively backed Azerbaijan in the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, tipping the balance of power and signaling that it would actively shape regional outcomes rather than merely respond to them. In Libya, Turkey intervened militarily to prevent the collapse of the UN, recognized government demonstrating a willingness to project force far beyond its borders, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, Ankara has asserted sweeping maritime claims and pushed back against Greek and European attempts to limit its influence, showing that it will not allow historical rivals to dictate the strategic environment. All of this reflects a larger structural logic. Rising states, when faced with expanding opportunities and declining constraints, begin to pursue greater autonomy and influence. Turkey's leadership understands this dynamic intuitively. It recognizes that geography has once again become a source of advantage, sitting at the intersection of Europe, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the Caucasus. Turkey occupies a position that few states can match. Control over these spaces, whether through direct influence, strategic partnerships, or military presence, gives Ankara leverage that can be translated into economic, political, and military power. This strategic confidence is reinforced by material factors. Turkey's defense industry has undergone a dramatic transformation, moving from heavy reliance on imported systems to producing some of the world's most capable drones, advanced armored vehicles, and naval platforms. The Bayraktar TB2, which played decisive roles in conflicts from Ukraine to the Caucasus, symbolized this new era. Turkey's military capability is no longer theoretical or latent. It has been tested in real conflicts and proven effective. This matters enormously in a world returning to hard power politics, because states that can deploy force quickly and at scale gain disproportionate influence over regional outcomes. Economic growth also plays a role, even if Turkey faces periodic instability. Rising powers do not need perfect economies. They need resilient ones that can sustain military modernization and long-term strategic projects. Despite inflation, political uncertainty, and institutional challenges, Turkey has maintained a level of economic dynamism that supports its growing geopolitical ambition. It continues to expand trade routes, energy corridors, and infrastructure projects that deepen its influence across Eurasia, from the Zangezur corridor debates to gas transit discussions with Russia and Central Asia. These are not isolated moves. They are part of a broader design to place Turkey at the center of regional connectivity. Another key part of this awakening is Turkey's ability to balance among great powers. Instead of aligning blindly with the United States or fully pivoting to Russia, Turkey has chosen a far more sophisticated approach: strategic hedging. It buys Russian S-400 missiles while simultaneously hosting key NATO assets. It cooperates with Moscow in Syria while competing with it in the Caucasus and Black Sea. It maintains economic ties with the EU while confronting European states in the Mediterranean. This multi-directional strategy is grounded in the belief that no single external partner can guarantee Turkey's interests. Ankara is positioning itself to benefit from the emerging multipolar world where flexibility and leverage matter more than loyalty. Critics in the West often misinterpret this as unpredictability or opportunism, but from a realist perspective, it is entirely logical. Rising powers maximize their options, avoid becoming dependent on any single patron, and take advantage of rivalries among larger states. Turkey is behaving exactly as a state would when it senses its own growing power and the declining ability of others to constrain it. Perhaps the most underappreciated factor in Turkey's awakening is its historical consciousness. States with imperial legacies often retain a deep sense of strategic entitlement. They believe they are destined to play major roles in the international system. Turkey is no exception. Its political discourse increasingly reflects a view of the world in which the Ottoman past is not merely history, but a reservoir of identity and ambition. This does not mean Turkey seeks to rebuild an empire, but it does mean it will not accept a confined secondary status. Its leaders see the current century as an opportunity to reclaim influence that was lost after World War I and suppressed during the Cold War. This convergence of structural shifts, strategic recalculations, material growth, and historical memory has produced a Turkey that is far more assertive than at any point in the last 100 years. It is now a state that perceives itself as a rising great power, one that has both the capability and the intent to shape the balance of power across multiple regions. The West's failure to recognize this transformation is one of the central miscalculations of modern geopolitics. The United States continues to approach Turkey as if it were the same state it managed in the 1,990 seconds, while Europe treats it as a troublesome neighbor that must be contained, rather than a strategic actor that must be engaged on equal terms. These attitudes are increasingly disconnected from reality, and they carry serious risks as Turkey continues to expand its reach. The strategic awakening underway is not reversible. Once a state begins to act like a great power, asserting interests, projecting force, reshaping regions, it rarely returns to a subordinate role. Turkey has crossed that threshold. The question now is not whether Turkey is rising, but how its rise will collide with the ambitions of other powers, how it will manage escalating competition, and what new conflicts or realignments may emerge as we move deeper into the next phase of its rise into the section that follows. The return of hard power politics is not a theoretical concept. It is the defining reality of the emerging international order. And Turkey understands this better than most states. For 3 decades after the Cold War, Western policymakers clung to the belief that economic integration, institutions, and liberal norms would tame geopolitical competition. They assumed that military force would become a relic of the past, that great power conflict would be avoided through cooperation, and that states would restrain their ambitions voluntarily. That worldview collapsed in slow motion, undone by wars in Iraq, interventions in Libya, the rise of China, and Russia's increasing assertiveness. But it was the 2022 invasion of Ukraine that finally shattered whatever illusions remain. Hard power territory, military capability, coercion returned to center stage, and Turkey responded by accelerating its own strategic transformation. The logic behind this shift is straightforward. When the international system becomes more anarchic, when rivalries intensify, and when major powers begin testing each other's resolve, states that rely on diplomacy alone inevitably fall behind. Turkey watched the United States overextend itself in the Middle East, drain resources in Afghanistan, and lose credibility after a series of failed interventions. It saw Russia reassert control in Georgia, Crimea, and Syria. It observed China's steady militarization of the South China Sea and its rise as a challenger to American global dominance. These developments sent a clear message. The world was returning to an era where coercive power, not moral appeals or institutional rules, determines outcome. For Turkey, The shift was not merely observational. It felt the consequences directly. The United States armed and trained Kurdish groups in Syria, despite Turkey's repeated warnings about the threat they posed to its territorial integrity. European states attempted to sideline Turkey from energy exploration in the eastern Mediterranean by forming exclusive security and economic partnerships. Russia entrenched itself in Syria, limiting Turkey's operational room in a region historically central to its security. Each of these developments underscored the same fundamental point. Turkey could not rely on others to defend its interests. It had to be ready to use force. This realization fueled the rapid modernization of Turkey's military posture. The rise of its drone program, with platforms like the TB2 and Akinci, represents the most visible aspect of this transformation. These systems gave Turkey affordable, scalable, and highly effective tools for projecting power. In Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkish drones overwhelmed Armenian defenses and allowed Azerbaijan to recapture territories it had lost decades earlier. It was a vivid demonstration that technology, when integrated into a coherent strategy, can overturn entrenched power balances. The message resonated across the world, particularly in states that had long underestimated Turkey's military innovation. The same logic played out in Libya, where Turkey intervened decisively in 2019 to prevent the collapse of the Tripoli-based government. European states, despite their rhetoric about diplomacy and stability, proved unwilling to commit meaningful military resources. Russia backed Khalifa Haftar with mercenaries and advanced weaponry, expecting little resistance. But when Turkey deployed drones, advisors, and air defense systems, the balance shifted almost immediately. Haftar's forces retreated, and the conflict stalemated under conditions favorable to Ankara. That intervention was not just about Libya. It signaled to Europe and the Middle East that Turkey would not accept strategic outcomes created by others at its expense. In Syria, the return of hard power politics unfolded even more starkly. After years of watching the United States armed groups linked to the PKK, and after repeated failures to secure its border through diplomacy, Turkey launched a series of cross-border operations to establish control over key territories. These actions were not symbolic. Turkey created buffer zones, established military outposts, and engaged in direct combat against both Kurdish militants and, at times, pro-regime forces backed by Russia. It was a messy, dangerous environment, exactly the kind of setting where states that lack resolve are punished. But Turkey's willingness to employ force ensured that it preserved its strategic interests, even when dealing with major powers. Hard power also returned in Turkey's management of the Black Sea and its response to the war in Ukraine. As a NATO member, Turkey provided drones and diplomatic support to Ukraine, yet it refused to join Western sanctions on Russia, kept open channels with Moscow, and asserted control over the Montreux Convention to regulate naval access to the Black Sea. This balancing act was not a product of indecision. It was a calculated strategy designed to preserve Turkey's influence while preventing either side from dominating the region. Such maneuvering requires both diplomatic skill and credible military capability. Without the latter, Turkey would have been sidelined. Critics often argue that Turkey's assertiveness risks overextension or confrontation with more powerful states. But this critique misses the structural shift that is unfolding. In an era where great powers are increasingly distracted Washington by China, Russia by its own economic constraints, Europe, by internal fragmentation, middle powers with strategic geography and military capability possess unprecedented opportunities. Turkey sits at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It controls access to the Black Sea, influences energy transit routes, and serves as a buffer between multiple conflict zones. In a world returning to hard power politics, this geographic advantage becomes a source of leverage that few states can match. Another key factor in the resurgence of hard power politics is the rise of multipolarity. When power is concentrated in a single dominant state, as it was during the unipolar moment, smaller states have limited room to maneuver. But as power diffuses among several major players, competition intensifies and alliances become more fluid. Turkey has exploited this shift with remarkable precision. It cooperates with Russia in defense technology while counterbalancing Russian influence in the Caucasus. It participates in NATO while openly challenging American policies in Syria. It engages with China on economic initiatives while maintaining strategic partnerships with Ukraine and Europe. This type of flexible alignment is only possible in a system where power is dispersed and rivalry is widespread. The return of hard power also reflects the failures of liberal internationalism. Institutions did not prevent wars in the Middle East. Democracy promotion backfired repeatedly. Economic globalization created vulnerabilities rather than stability. Turkey learned from these failures. It stopped viewing institutions as guarantees and began treating them as tools to be used when convenient and ignored when necessary. This realist recalibration explains why Turkey pursues independent defense production, seeks alternative financial partners, and cultivates influence in regions where Western engagement has declined. The future risks associated with this shift are significant. A world defined by hard power is a world defined by friction, competition, and potential conflict. Turkey's assertiveness inevitably places it at odds with other regional and global players. Tensions with Greece over maritime boundaries remain unresolved and could escalate if diplomatic channels fail. Relations with the United States are strained and could deteriorate further as Washington deepens its support for Kurdish forces. Russia, despite its cooperation with Turkey, remains a rival with conflicting interests in Syria, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea. Each of these arenas presents the possibility of miscalculation, and as history teaches, rising powers often collide with established ones when ambitions overlap. Yet the underlying structural forces driving Turkey's behavior are not going away. As long as the international system remains competitive, as long as power remains fragmented, and as long as states continue to pursue security through strength rather than trust, Turkey will double down on hard power as the central pillar of its grand strategy. The country's leadership understands that influence is not inherited, it is taken through decisive action. And in a world where military capability once again shapes political reality, Turkey intends to be a state that shapes outcomes rather than one that adapts to them, setting the stage for the next phase of its rise into the section that follows. The consequences of a rising Turkish sphere are profound, multidimensional, and increasingly unavoidable. Rising powers always produce friction. Their ascent reshapes regional hierarchies, challenges established norms, and forces other states to recalibrate their strategies. Turkey is no exception. Its expansion of influence across the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and parts of North Africa is generating a cascade of political, military, and economic consequences that few outside Ankara fully appreciate. This is not mere speculation. It is the predictable outcome of structural forces that define international politics. States do not accommodate the ambitions of rising powers willingly, and rising powers, in turn, cannot be expected to accept a subordinate status without contesting it. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey's assertiveness has disrupted the balance that the European Union and Greece long sought to maintain. The exploration and militarization of contested maritime zones is not a trivial matter. It represents a shift in the energy and security calculus of the region. Turkey's drilling initiatives, backed by naval deployments and air power, signal that it will enforce its claims regardless of external pressure. This assertiveness has already forced Cyprus, Greece, and EU members to rethink their strategies, leading to the strengthening of regional alliances and the acceleration of military procurement programs. The strategic consequences extend far beyond localized disputes over gas fields. They affect NATO cohesion, European security policy, and the broader perception of American credibility. When rising powers challenge established orders, the resulting instability is rarely contained to a single geographic area. In the Middle East, Turkey's interventions in Syria, Iraq, and Libya illustrate how an assertive state can alter the trajectory of conflicts in its immediate neighborhood. In Syria, Ankara's cross-border operations have created de facto zones of influence, reshaping demographic and political realities along its southern border. Its efforts against Kurdish groups, combined with limited cooperation and strategic competition with Russia and Iran, demonstrate a willingness to pursue security interests even when confronted by more powerful states. In Libya, Turkey's military support for the Tripoli government prevented a decisive victory by Khalifa Haftar's forces, altering the post-revolutionary balance of power and ensuring Ankara's role as a central arbiter in North African geopolitics. These interventions have consequences that ripple outward. They signal to other states that Turkey will act unilaterally to protect and expand its interests, thereby increasing the probability of both direct confrontation and proxy competition. The South Caucasus is another arena where Turkey's rising sphere is redefining regional dynamics. The 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War, where Turkey provided decisive military assistance to Azerbaijan, illustrated the ability of a rising power to reshape long-standing territorial conflicts. Turkish drones and strategic advice enabled Azerbaijan to reclaim large portions of territory it had lost decades earlier, fundamentally altering the regional balance. This outcome has implications not just for Armenia and Azerbaijan, but for Russia, which had long assumed a monopoly on influence in the region. It signals that Ankara can challenge traditional great power prerogatives, creating a multipolar contest over influence where formerly there was near certainty about outcomes. Such recalibrations are rarely smooth. They generate tension, resentment, and the potential for future clashes. Economic consequences are equally significant. Turkey's strategic sphere is not limited to military influence. It extends to trade, energy, and infrastructure. The development of energy corridors connecting Turkey with Russia, Azerbaijan, and potentially Central Asia places Ankara at the center of regional energy security. This control provides both economic leverage and strategic flexibility, allowing Turkey to negotiate from a position of strength with powers that might otherwise try to constrain it. Furthermore, Turkey's Belt and Road related initiatives and investments in Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans expand its economic footprint while intertwining its interests with those of multiple states. A rising Turkish economic sphere complicates calculations for both the United States and the European Union, who must weigh their own strategic objectives against Ankara's growing autonomy. The rise of Turkey also carries important military and technological consequences. Its development of domestic defense industries, from drones to armored vehicles and naval systems, reduces reliance on foreign suppliers and grants Ankara operational freedom. This capability allows Turkey to pursue strategic objectives in a way that was impossible even a decade ago. It also forces neighboring states to invest heavily in countermeasures, thereby raising the stakes and the costs of potential conflicts. When one state strengthens its coercive capacity while neighboring powers lag behind, the risk of miscalculation rises dramatically. History is filled with examples where rising powers inadvertently triggered wars simply by acting in accordance with what they perceived as defensive or necessary strategic interests. Turkey's growing capabilities now place it squarely in this pattern. There are political and diplomatic consequences as well. Rising powers inevitably challenge existing alliances and norms, and Turkey is no exception. Its flexible balancing between the United States, Russia, and other regional actors creates friction within NATO. European states perceive Ankara's actions as unpredictable, undermining the assumption that Western alliances operate on shared principles and interests. Diplomacy becomes a tool subordinate to power. Negotiations are conducted under the shadow of credible coercive capability. This is the classical realist calculation. Power underwrites influence, and influence reshapes the behavior of others. Turkey is applying this principle with increasing sophistication, and the resulting instability is a natural consequence of a rising state testing the boundaries of its power. Perhaps the most consequential aspect of Turkey's rise is the precedent it sets for other middle powers. When one state successfully expands its influence through a combination of military, economic, and diplomatic initiatives, neighboring states are forced to reconsider their own strategies. Some will attempt to match Turkey's capabilities, while others will form counter-alliances. Both responses can heighten regional tension. Turkey's rise, therefore, does not occur in isolation. It has a multiplier effect, provoking strategic recalculations across the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and even North Africa. This dynamic of cascading recalibration is well documented in history. Rising powers challenge existing orders, established powers resist, and smaller states maneuver to avoid being dominated. The process generates friction, competition, and all too often, conflict. Turkey's rise also carries implications for global great powers. The United States, already overstretched and distracted by other theaters, faces a strategic dilemma: accommodate Turkey's ambitions and risk weakening alliances elsewhere, or confront Ankara and risk pushing a key regional actor into more adversarial alignments. Russia, while cooperating with Turkey in Syria and energy projects, must now account for Ankara's capacity to influence outcomes in areas Moscow once considered its exclusive sphere. Europe faces the prospect of a more assertive neighbor whose security and economic interests do not always align with Brussels' objectives. These strategic dilemmas are a direct consequence of Turkey's growing autonomy and expanding influence. The consequences extend to conflict escalation, unintended crises, and the possibility of miscalculation. Rising powers do not operate in a vacuum, and Turkey's assertiveness is increasing the probability that confrontations, whether over maritime boundaries, energy corridors, or proxy conflicts, will escalate. Misreading intentions, underestimating capabilities, or misjudging resolve can trigger localized crises that spiral into broader conflicts. History demonstrates that the rise of powers frequently generates war, not because leaders desire it, but because competition, insecurity, and misperception produce outcomes that no one intended. Turkey's expanding sphere introduces precisely this type of risk, both regionally and potentially globally. Strategically, the consequences of Turkey's rise also underscore a broader shift in international norms. The world is returning to the logic of power politics. Influence is earned, enforced, and contested through capability and action rather than legal claims or moral authority. States like Turkey that master this logic will shape outcomes far more effectively than those relying on institutions, diplomacy alone, or the assumption of enduring alliances. This has ramifications for the way conflicts are managed, the way alliances are structured, and the way states calculate risk. The established order is no longer a given. It is increasingly contingent on the relative power and strategic acumen of states willing to assert themselves. In sum, Turkey's rising sphere generates consequences across military, political, economic, and strategic dimensions. It challenges established powers, alters regional hierarchies, provokes strategic recalculations, and increases the risk of miscalculation and conflict. It also signals a broader return to hard power politics in which the combination of military capability, strategic initiative, and geographic advantage defines influence. These consequences are not hypothetical, they are unfolding in real time, and they will continue to shape the contours of Eurasian politics for the foreseeable future, setting the stage for deeper consideration of the systemic risks and strategic dilemmas that emerge as Turkey consolidates its influence and extends its reach. The rise of Turkey is no longer a distant possibility. It is a strategic reality, reshaping the balance of power across Eurasia and the Middle East. Policymakers who underestimate Ankara do so at their peril. Turkey's growing military capabilities, strategic acumen, and willingness to assert influence independently make it a force that cannot be ignored, appeased superficially, or contained without risk. The miscalculations of the past, over-reliance on alliances, underestimating national ambitions, and ignoring structural imperatives offer clear lessons. The West, regional powers, and even global actors must recognize that Turkey will pursue its interests relentlessly with consequences for energy, security, and regional alignments. History demonstrates that rising powers do not wait politely for permission. Turkey's ascent is inevitable, and its implications are already unfolding. Those who fail to adjust their strategies now will face costly surprises, strategic setbacks, and the unavoidable reality that a new regional and potentially global order is taking shape.